Welcome to this App Ventures presentation. My name is Peter Thompson, and in this presentation we're looking at managing content load in presenting and training. In a moment, we'll look at something that many of us may have been guilty of in the past in our roles as presenters and trainers. Or if you've been working in an organisation for more than a couple of months, you will almost certainly have been subjected to something like the slide we're about to see. It's not rude or violent, but it could be described as something horrible. It's the standard slide you can see in many places. There's usually a logo and some more branding, and then it goes something like this. Now, allow me to use up an extraordinary portion of your day and your highly valuable time by reading out a huge amount of stuff to you that you could read for yourself. Of course, and so on it goes. Now, many of us might have inflicted slides like this on people in the past. However, as if the excruciating experience of sitting through a session like that wasn't enough, we now have good, solid research that tells us that slides like that not only do not help people learn, they actually get in the way of learning, especially if the presenter reads them while the audience is trying to read. So from now on, there is no excuse really for creating slides like that. Why? Because we're dealing with people's working memory. And working memory has capacity limitations. To help you understand these limitations, let's think about this. If I were to read out a string of numbers at a steady rate, how many do you think you would be able to remember? Say, for example, 0, 2, 9, 6, 6, 7, 4, 3, and on it goes, until we get up to about 50. While those numbers are coming up, think about this. What if I asked you if you could remember 50 numbers? I wonder what your answer would be. Although there are some people with special techniques who can remember large series of numbers, very few of them mind you, most people can remember only a few. In 1956, there was a landmark paper published by George Miller, and in its title it had these words: the magical number. Put simply, Miller was investigating the capacity limitations of working memory. Thinking for a moment about a unit of information being called a chunk, the interest was in the number of chunks of information we can hold in working memory. A chunk might be a single digit, or a word, or maybe even more than that. In any case, he proposed that the magical number was 7, plus or minus 2. That is, if you recall the number remembering exercise on the previous slide, most people would be able to hold between 5 and 9 of those numbers in working memory. However, some recent research suggests that in fact the number might be as low as that, 4. Now let's think about why it's called the magical number. Let's look at that chunk again. We said that a chunk could be a single digit, for example, or a word, which is bigger in a sense than a single digit. So what we know about the chunk's size is that it can grow. So let's look again at those numbers. Before we do anything with them, let me ask you this question. Even with all your gadgets like smartphones, can you still remember 5 phone numbers? Usually, I find most people in my audiences can remember 5 phone numbers. Sometimes a few can't, and many can remember more. But think about 5 phone numbers. So let's look at these numbers and rearrange them a bit. Now the numbers are in chunks of 10, but let's rearrange them a bit more. Now, does that look more familiar in form? These could be phone numbers, an area code followed by 2 chunks of 4. That's how we chunk, that is, organise phone numbers to help remember them. And we also associate them with people's names. So by organising strings of numbers into manageable chunks and making meaningful associations, we can remember these strings of numbers. By the way, if you can remember 5 phone numbers, and if you write all 5 down in a sequence and count the number of digits, how many digits have you got there? Well, there'll be at least 50, and maybe even 60 if they are mobile numbers. So knowing that our working memories can only effectively work with a small number of chunks, this gives some important questions to think about. One obvious question is, what does need to be on the slide? However, I offer this suggestion that many times a more useful question to ask is, what does not need to be on the slide? By the way, that same question can be applied to written documents, diagrams on paper, and e-learning videos. Now, one of the best ways with working with slides is, when it's appropriate, use images with a minimum of labelling and work with the image to bring it alive for your audience. Let's look at a simple example with this slide on cognitive load. Remember, to help people learn, we have to help them manage their memory. And broadly speaking, we have two types of memory. There's working memory and long-term. And we have to help facilitate getting stuff from working memory into long-term memory and vice versa. And to do that, we have to manage people's attention. There are a number of ways of doing this, but in the first instance, if you remember the capacity limitations of working memory, and you keep that in mind when you're designing written materials, slides and videos, that will take you a long way. However, your question still might be, all right, how exactly do I do that? So let's look at a couple of examples that demonstrate principles that you can apply to slides, documents, e-learning materials and videos. Here's a more standard way of delivering the information about George Miller's paper on the magical number. Now, if you really want your audience to have all this information and all this text, please give it to them on a handout, or email a PDF document to them as a follow-up reminder after your session. But please avoid inflicting this sort of slide on them during a presentation. Having said that, I do know that some organisations have very strict rules about what has to be on a slide because of branding or because of their protocols, particularly if they're giving external public presentations. So if you're forced to use lots of words on a slide, try highlighting key words. Then, with highlighted key words, you can work with the screen and direct people's attention to the highlighted words. A word of warning though, colour won't necessarily work for everyone. Remember, some people are colourblind, so even better. Remove as many words as you can, or as you're allowed to, and aim to keep the number of bullet points to 7 or less. If you can, make your slide even more diagram-like, as you've already seen. By the way, this of course means the presenter has to do more work in explaining the slide, telling related stories if they're relevant, and making the slide meaningful and memorable. However, here's the point. The reason for having a presenter or facilitator in the room is to bring the material to life, make it memorable, and help people learn from it. And that doesn't happen if someone just reads out a whole heap of text. So let's look at one more simple example. All your design elements can be used to manage attention, make the experience enjoyable, and make the material memorable. I present a one-day training on that, by the way. Here's a list of some of the elements. As you can see, presented like this, they're just a meaningless list. But let's rearrange them. That probably feels better already, doesn't it? Very quickly, your brain will recognise that there seems to be some relationship between the items in each group. With the previous slide, your brain would have been working overtime to try to sort out if there were any meaningful relationships in the list. But we can do better than this. Let's highlight each group as we present it. Here, the focus is on the design elements relating to layout. And here, it's on colour and its applications. And here it's on features of text. And finally, it's on attributes that make things like animations meaningful and useful. And when each group has been discussed, you can show the whole lot to remind people how much they have covered. But we can still do better. The world has enough bullet points already. To be fair, they can be very useful, but the organisation we've chosen for this slide means that they're just more stuff your brain has to process, and that can impede learning. In this case, there's absolutely no need for them, is there? But we do have to help people to distinguish the headings on this slide, so let's do that. Okay, so now the slide is becoming more meaningful. The headings are in bold, and in fact, they are a slightly different colour. But as we said before, remember that something like 9% of males have some form of colour blindness, and something like 4% of females, if I have that figure correct. When you want to use colour to distinguish something, you should also use some other attribute. So let's try this. And now, with a subtle but important adjustment to that slide, now the boxes on that slide are evenly distributed. Even if people didn't consciously notice the slight uneven spacing on the previous slide, it's still stuff for their working memory to process. Now, we have a more meaningful layout, and if you were presenting these, it would be better to present each box separately, like this. Pretty much as we did before, going through and discussing and making the information that is being displayed meaningful as you proceed. And remember to let your audience see at the end what you've covered. So please keep the magical number in mind when designing your presentations and trainings and organising the content into chunks that can be held in working memory. Thank you for taking the time to view this video. I really do hope it's been helpful to you and that you've enjoyed it as well. I can be contacted via my website displayed on screen. This is Peter Thompson, and thank you again for joining me.